Hi, it's Global Politics with Jim Martin. Today I want to talk about Vaclav Havel and his essay, The Power of the Powerless. This was written in 1985. Now, everyone that I've talked to, I get excited about things and I'll say, hey, do you know Vaclav Havel? And no one that I know knows who Vaclav Havel is. So I figure it's probably a good idea to do a real quick Jim Martin run through some of that history and his life. I'm moving real fast and likely to skip parts and may even have a few flubs in here, but this is the gist of who Vaclav Havel was and what he did. So Vaclav Havel, as a young person, was born in Czechoslovakia, and World War II rapidly swept over that region of the world, of Central Europe. Now, after the war, the Red Army had taken the entire region during World War II and quickly moved to install a friendly communist regime in Czechoslovakia. During that time, he's just living his life with his family and everything else. Obviously, he's just a little kid, but he grew up to be a playwright and a poet. And eventually he reached a point where he had written some plays, he had produced some plays, and they had been performed in various cities in Czechoslovakia. Many people liked them. He was relatively successful at what he did. And at that point, because it's communism, he's part of that system, a committee for the arts or something like that, that helps sponsor these kinds of activities and censors them. But he's like, I'm not political. I'm just here doing things and having a good time. So, theater kid. He grows up in this and becomes a relatively successful playwright. Now, in the late 60s, early 70s, some colleagues of his, I don't really think he knew them very well, but they were part of the arts movement in Czechoslovakia that formed a music group. And this music group was called the Plastic People of the Inevitable. And they emulated Western bands that they had become aware of that were popular during that time, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd and other bands like that. And so they did cover tunes of those bands and they had some of their own music. Similarly, they weren't political, but they had long hair and they looked like hippies and they were playing this weird music and so forth and so on. So the state took notice of that. They put them on trial for being against the wishes of society, so to speak, and put them in prison. Now, Havel was quite upset with this. He saw that as an affront to the arts and freedom of expression and these things, and he began to gain some political awareness. Maybe he had it before that, but this is when he starts to really kind of act on that. During this time, he wrote a play, and the name of it escapes me at the moment, but it was a funny, sometimes serious, yet meaningful play that was about modern life. And what he did was work in a number of subtle jokes and funny things and scenes that exposed various aspects of what it was like to live in a communist regime. He wasn't directly criticizing them, he's just kind of putting them out there and putting people in these funny situations. And it became wildly popular. The thing was, it's got like double entendres, double meanings, and all kinds of things are floating around within it. You could go, if you weren't super bright or used to that kind of writing, you could go to that and just be like, that's a funny play. Wow, haha, look, those people were silly. It became such a popular play that the regime took notice and like, hey, look at this great playwright. He's helping to lead us to the socialist vision of the arts and all this sort of thing, because they hadn't really paid attention to what it was about. It even caught the attention of people in the West, and people were starting to talk about it in the West and so forth and so on. Then somebody in the regime figured it out. What they did was they kind of had made this guy a little bit of a golden child in a way, and they couldn't really just put him in prison or something like that. They couldn't treat him like they treated the Plastic People of the Inevitable. So what they did was say, well, you can no longer be a playwright. you need to go work in construction or meat packing or something like that. So they just gave him a job in that kind of environment. And he was like, okay, whatever. So he goes to do these jobs, but he's got these networks. And it must have been kind of funny to see someone like him show up at a construction site to like carry lumber and drive nails and stuff, because he was very well known in Czechoslovakia at the time. And I'm sure some of his coworkers would have been like, dude, what are you doing here? He's living in this, but he has this network of people that he created through the relative fame that he gathered as a playwright. And he begins to make connections with other people who aren't happy with the way the system is. That brings us to the next step, is that he begins to connect with some of these people, both within Czechoslovakia, but in other Eastern Bloc countries like Romania and Poland, so forth, East Germany, not to advocate for revolution or violent overthrow or to make a terrorist group or anything like that, but rather to create a community of people who have similar ideas. And they began to write essays about things and stuff. And so this particular essay was featured in, along with a number of other essays, in the mid 80s, which is still during communism, for those of you who don't remember. So now the regime is like, okay, we can't really allow this to happen. He's got this essay, they're publishing it underground, they're getting it out to the West. He's got his name on it because he's like, I don't care. They put him in prison. So he's in prison, and that's the way that goes until 1989. Communism begins to fall apart, and it rapidly disassembles itself all across Eastern Europe. And very suddenly, Czechoslovakia finds itself in a place where there's no more Russian troops, there's no more communist regime. So what are we going to do now? And a lot of people began to press for him to be the next president. He had been released from prison shortly before the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia. Now, they began to advocate for him to be president, and they went for him and like, you need to run for president. And he was like, I don't want to do that, man. I just want to go back and be a playwright. He really kind of tore himself up about that, but he had written these essays about service and doing these things. And so he thought, well, I guess I have to. So he ran for president, and he won in a landslide, and he won re-election in a landslide, and then he stepped away from politics and wrote some plays and had a good time. Now, he was a sort of leader that, boy, I wish we had people like him around today. Not a perfect human being, you can look him up, but his leadership and his general countenance and the way that he treated people was the sort of thing that I think anyone would say, I would love my children to aspire to be like that. A good leader, in other words. So now you're up to speed on who Vaclav Havel was and the context. Let's talk about this essay and the central ideas in it. The first thing to think about is that, so he's writing this within an authoritarian regime, one that in 1968 had attempted some mild reforms that were then crushed by troops from the Soviet Union. Many people were killed, many people jailed. He's living in a time frame after that. He describes this authoritarian regime as intricate, full of rules regarding what you can say and do, but it doesn't really care if you believe in the principles that underpin it or not. We're not talking about everyone is thinking that there's going to be a glorious socialist future and we're marching towards this, and they don't really care that much about that. They just want you to pay it lip service and to act as if. It exists really to perpetuate itself, and it exacts compliance by bribing people, jobs, material conditions, vacation spots, these kinds of things, through negative social norms that discourage disobedience of any kind and encourage the active participation in various organizations that are related to the communist regime, that you show up on the proper holidays, that you put the proper signs in your yard, that you say the proper things, and if necessary, through repression and violence. It requires, in other words, in Havel's words, living in a lie, compliance, going along to get along, self-censorship. The next concept that he talks about is the hidden sphere. That's society at large, with a myriad of different privately held attitudes, values, and beliefs. What happens within it and those attitudes, values, and beliefs are often unknown to the elites who are running the authoritarian regime. They don't know these things because they don't really hang out with regular people. They hang out with their own bubble of other authoritarians who are just kind of going along, moving that system down the tracks. Now, within the hidden sphere, he talks about how it's possible for an individual to choose to live in the truth. This is an individual phenomenon. And for Havel, it meant regaining his own sense of dignity and his responsibility for his place in society. All expressions of a free, true life, no matter how small or how large, contribute to living in the truth, and thus are threats to the system. They represent greater or lesser risks to those individuals who choose to live in the truth. That means that small acts of defiance, going to a protest, participating in an art exhibition where banned things are shown, all these little small things that may or may not make any kind of difference, to Havel, they all matter and they all contribute to one's own sense of living in the truth, but also giving permission to others to do that as well by modeling that behavior. When people who are living in the truth connect, they may or may not, depending on their own free will, create parallel structures that are within that hidden sphere. These, in part, fulfill the needs and desires of community for those people who are outside of the system, who see themselves as outside of the authoritarian regime, for education, connection, labor unions, music and the arts, even medicine. These are informal, semi-formal things, and the state would definitely not approve of any of them. They don't have licenses. They haven't filled out the proper paperwork, all of that kind of stuff. They do their own thing beneath the radar of the authoritarian regime, which has its own structures for that, which are very formal and have rules and everything else. In Poland, for instance, they used to have flying universities, which essentially meant that academics would go from place to place, informally have these under the radar meetings and talk about economics or history or whatever, but to be free about it and actually talk about real things, not what the state wants them to talk about. So you have this hidden sphere, you have these parallel structures, you have people living in the truth. Like, what happens? Where do we go from here? And one might be tempted to think about reform. Now, in the Czechoslovak context, one has to think about 1968, the attempts at reform that led to the brutal crackdown by the Russians, who killed, tortured, and imprisoned, many thousands of people as a result of that. So his thoughts on reforming an authoritarian system, he's like, it's not bad in and of itself that elites from within the system might want to make things a little bit better for people, or to change things, or free up the judiciary, or restrict police, or even just to make free speech a more of a priority. But he sees those as surface level changes, because those elites operating within those systems really aren't talking about changing the foundational principles of that system. They're talking about reform. They want to preserve their place and their privileges within it. And therefore, it's not truly part of living in the truth when you talk about reform. He sees true change as coming from that hidden sphere, regular people. He talks about leaders in that hidden sphere in a way that might not be familiar to a lot of people. He sees leadership within that realm as being free to the absolute maximum degree possible of any ulterior motives involving power, position, or wealth. So none of these actors who want to run the movement or be elected to something or to be the party minister of whatever, they shouldn't want to lead, in Havel's view. They should take that responsibility if it is pressed upon them. They shouldn't want it. They should just do it because it's the right thing to do. Rather, simply to live collectively in the truth and to seek a better life. That's the point. And a better society. And here's a key point, not in some imaginary future, but now, within that hidden sphere and the parallel structures within it, to create the society that they want to be a part of under the noses of the authoritarian regime. And I think that's a really interesting point because that's what they did. So a word too that I thought was particularly interesting and pertinent and prescient of Havel was his discussions on technological society. And so I'm going to quote some of these things. And recall, this is written in 1985. So we have printing presses, we have radio, we have television, maybe we had fax machines. Technology, that child of modern society, is out of humanity's control, has ceased to serve us, has enslaved us, and compelled us to participate in the preparation of our own destruction. That coldly functioning machine we have created engulfs us, tearing us away from our natural affiliations, removes us from the experience of being, and casts us into the world of existences. People are manipulated in ways that are infinitely more subtle and refined than simple brute force and violence as manipulative tactics. Now, he's speaking in some sense about nuclear weapons. However, communication, and you think about the internet, and you think about the rise of disinformation campaigns, the rise of influencers, social media campaigns in general, AI, and the advances and dangers that it presents within the context of what he's talking about here. And you're like, wow, that's intense. Now, one might ask, well, what is he going to do about it? So now you have this parallel structure, you're living in the truth, but the state is still there and it's going to repress you at some point or another, as he found out because he went to prison. What is to be done? So he's talking about living in the truth no matter what the consequences. He talks about how a renewed focus on real people is needed, not elites, not manufactured personalities, these kinds of things. He talks about the rehabilitation of values like trust, openness, responsibility, solidarity, and love within those groups. He warns that any accumulation of power whatsoever should be profoundly alien to us. So again, no one who's angling to do something or manipulating people to go in a certain direction. He also cautions that rather than a strategic agglomeration of formalized organizations, the hidden sphere and its parallel structures, it's better to have ad hoc organizations within that hidden sphere and in the parallel structures, infused with enthusiasm by those who create them. So for the arts or for education or for medicine or for law or whatever it happens to be, auto mechanics, whatever it is, informal ad hoc organizations with, I will say, a horizontal authority structure. So nobody's in charge, but we're all just kind of like, hey, I like to do these sorts of things. I like to play guitar. Let's do something. All the way up to, hey, I like to educate people, or hey, I'm really interested in water quality. Let's try to figure these things out. Or I'm really interested in democracy. Let's try to figure these things out. Nobody in charge, ad hoc, informal organization with people who are committed to doing those things because they are truly passionate about it. Now, he wrote this before he went to prison, and so he had no idea that communism was going to fall apart. Now, maybe someday he might have said, but he never really talked about that. He's discussing this living in the truth, renewed focus on people, rehabilitation of values, accumulation of powers off limits, ad hoc organizations, in the context of this underground hidden sphere movement. He's not talking about like this is going to replace anything or anything like that. And another thing that he was absolutely opposed to is the use of violence to achieve any sort of revolutionary aims. He's talking about a groundswell of change within a society itself in its values, attitudes, and beliefs, of freeing them up to see a path, not to overthrow a system violently. That he really thought, and others of his ilk, that this would be a spontaneous process that would hopefully have no violence whatsoever. And in many of the Eastern European countries, communism really died with a whimper, not with a bang. Romania is the only one where there was a violent overthrow of the regime itself, and Azerbaijan. One thing to consider here is that, he's not creating a handbook on revolution. He's talking about how do you live within an authoritarian regime. I think the lessons are really interesting to consider within our own context here in the United States and for other people who live in regimes that have strayed away from democratic norms, attitudes, values, and beliefs. I really enjoyed this article. I think that it absolutely fits our context today, and it's something that certainly resonates with me. I hope that you all have learned something today. If you know more about Havel than me, which is absolutely possible, please feel free to share something in the comments. Please subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I'm trying to grow it so that I can continue to put out the sorts of videos that you enjoy on a regular basis. And I look forward to talking to you all again very soon. Thanks.